My wife's will left our house to one son, but the hidden stipulation inside forced the other to face a secret guardian and a debt older than our marriage. The will reading was supposed to be a formality, a quiet, dignified wrap-up to my wife Sarah's life. It had been 3 months since the accident, 3 months of navigating the silent, echoing halls of the house we'd built together, the house where we raised Mark, and then later, our younger son, David. I sat there in the mahogany-paneled office of old Mr. Henderson, Sarah's lawyer, clutching the damp linen handkerchief Sarah always carried. Mark, 28, sharp and already successful in his own right, sat ramrod straight next to me, his jaw tight with suppressed grief. David, 24, still finding his footing after college, looked pale and lost on the other side of the heavy oak desk. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, the sound amplified in the oppressive silence. As per the last legally binding document signed by Sarah Jane Miller on the 15th of May, 2 years ago. He paused, adjusting his glasses, a deliberate, agonizing theatricality that made my heart thump against my ribs. Sarah had always hated that man's theatrics. The primary residence, the property located at 412 Willow Creek Lane, along with its contents, is bequeathed. I braced myself, expecting the standard division, or perhaps leaving it entirely to me, the surviving spouse, to manage until the boys were ready. That was the unspoken assumption, the foundation of our 30 years together. But Mr. Henderson didn't look at me. He looked directly at David, and then quickly shifted his gaze to Mark. The primary residence, 412 Willow Creek Lane, is bequeathed in its entirety to David Allen Miller. The silence that followed was so thick you could taste the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunbeams slicing through the blinds. My own breath hitched, a sharp involuntary gasp. I stared at the lawyer, certain there had been a terrible misreading, a simple auditory error on my part. But then Mark moved. It wasn't a subtle shift. It was a violent physical jolt, like a spring snapping under too much tension. He stood up so fast his antique wooden chair scraped backward across the polished floor with a shriek that made us all flinch. "What?" Mark's voice was low, dangerous, laced with an immediate scorching betrayal. He wasn't shouting yet, but the volume was irrelevant. The intent was clear enough to stop Mr. Henderson mid-sentence. Mark looked at me, his eyes wide, searching my face for an explanation, a confirmation that this was some sick joke. I shook my head dumbly, my throat suddenly dry as sandpaper. Sarah never mentioned this. Never, not once, in any casual conversation about the future, the estate, or even just talking about the house itself. "Excuse me, Mr. Henderson," Mark continued, his tone hardening into the voice he used when closing multi-million-dollar deals. "I believe there's been a clerical error. Dad, you need to clarify this. Mom left this house, our home, to David. Why?" He spun around, abandoning the lawyer, fixing his furious gaze on me. "Dad, did you know about this? You knew she was cutting me out, didn't you? Because I didn't take the banking internship? Because I chose software development over your stupid inherited business?" The accusation hung heavy in the air, venomous and sudden. He took a step toward me, his hands clenched at his sides, his face contorted with rage and shock. "You gave the house to my brother?" my son shouted, "until he learned the whole truth." I opened my mouth to defend myself, to say I had no idea, that Sarah must have had a reason, but Mark was past listening to reason. He pointed a trembling finger at David, who shrank back slightly, looking genuinely terrified by his older brother's outburst. "You just got handed the keys to the kingdom, didn't you, David? While I'm over here busting my ass, she gives you the one thing Dad and I always valued most." He took another threatening step, his breath coming in ragged gasps, poised to explode. And that's when Mr. Henderson, regaining some shred of professional composure, spoke over the mounting tension, his voice surprisingly loud and firm. "Mr. Mark, if you would allow me to finish reading the codicil attached to that specific bequest, you might understand why your mother made this decision. It's not an outright gift. It comes with a very specific and very non-negotiable clause." He tapped the thick parchment pointedly. Mark froze, caught mid-fury, His eyes narrowed with suspicious, predatory focus. He slowly turned back toward the desk, leaning over it, his shadow enveloping the lawyer. "Go on," he snarled. "Make it quick." Mr. Henderson cleared his throat again, pulled a single sheet of paper from the folder, and his gaze settled on Mark, a flicker of pity in his eyes. Sarah stipulated that David receives the house only on the express condition that he accepts responsibility for the mortgage, which, as of today, stands at... He named a figure that was astronomically high, a figure I knew Sarah had quietly been paying down for years, a figure that made David's eyes widen to saucers as he realized he was inheriting not a gift, but a crushing liability, and that he must also immediately take on the guardianship of the South Wing tenant, whom Sarah refers to only as the Watcher, requiring continuous 24-hour on-site supervision, a responsibility Sarah detailed extensively in an attached addendum. If David refuses these terms within 48 hours, the entire property reverts immediately to Mark. The silence that followed Mr. Henderson's declaration was different this time. It wasn't confusion or shock. It was a dense, heavy calculation settling over Mark, and pure, unadulterated dread washing over David. The furious, wounded rage in Mark's posture melted away, replaced by a chilling, predatory stillness. He straightened up slowly, a small, utterly humorless smile touching the corner of his mouth. He glanced at David, who looked like he was about to be sick, his face drained of color as he stared at the lawyer, as if the man had just handed him a ticking time bomb. "A mortgage," Mark said, his voice suddenly smooth, dangerously level. "A substantial one, I assume, considering Sarah's financial acumen." He tapped his chin thoughtfully, his earlier anger completely forgotten, replaced by the keen focus of a shark sensing blood in the water. "And this... Watcher? Who is this person, Mr. Henderson? And why on earth would Sarah legally tie the house to a live-in caretaker? Is this some kind of delayed revenge fantasy?" Mr. Henderson nervously shuffled the papers on his desk, clearly unhappy with the direction the reading had taken. "The addendum is quite clear on the matter of the Watcher, Mark. It states, and I quote, 'My son David must ensure the comfort and discretion of the individual residing in the South Wing. This person, whose identity I wish to keep private from my surviving spouse for now, must never be left unattended for more than 4 hours consecutively. This condition is paramount to the bequest.'" Sarah stressed that this was a non-negotiable element of David's inheritance. David finally found his voice, a shaky whisper. "Private from Dad? Why? And why me, Mom? Why would she put this burden on me?" He looked pleadingly at me, but I could only offer a shrug of helpless confusion. I knew nothing of this Watcher, nothing of a secret tenant in our own home. Sarah had been meticulous about everything. If there was someone living in the South Wing, she had kept it completely hidden from me. Mark stepped closer to David, his shadow falling over his younger brother. A live-in requirement, a massive debt, and a secret ward, all tied to the house? That sounds less like an inheritance and more like a community service sentence, David. He leaned in, his voice dropping conspiratorially, though the malice in his tone was unmistakable. "Think about it. If you refuse, the house comes to me, debt and all. But if I take over, I can pay off the mortgage instantly. And frankly, the idea of a secret tenant who needs constant monitoring sounds like a liability I'd rather not have to manage. It sounds like something messy." David instinctively backed away, bumping into the side of the heavy leather sofa. "It's not messy, Mark. It's Mom's last wish. She never did anything without reason." "Oh, she absolutely did things without reason, David," Mark countered, a chilling memory flashing across his face. "Remember that summer she insisted on boarding up the attic window because the light pollution was bothering the moon? She was eccentric. This sounds like peak eccentricity." Mark paced away, running a hand through his hair, clearly weighing the financial upside against the potential social embarrassment of a secret caretaker. "So, David, do you want to inherit crippling debt and be responsible for some stranger you can't even look in the eye without knowing their secret? Or do you want to pass it on to me, the responsible one, who can immediately liquidate the asset and settle the estate cleanly? David looked trapped. He was financially dependent, still relying on me for support, and the thought of the debt was terrifying. But the thought of abandoning his mother's final, strange request was worse. "I need to see the South Wing," David said, determination hardening his voice, silencing Mark's gloating. "I need to see who this person is before I decide anything. Mr. Henderson, can we go now? I need to see the addendum on the Watcher's care requirements, too." Mr. Henderson nodded wearily. "The keys are on the hook by the door, David. Sarah left explicit instructions that the first tour must take place immediately, and that you must enter the South Wing alone first. She also left a specific sealed envelope for you to open only once you are inside the apartment." Mark scoffed, but his eyes were glued to David's every move, a hunter watching his prey. "Alone? Alone with the mystery tenant? Fine. But if you don't come out in an hour agreeing to let me take over the deed, I'm calling my lawyers to review the legality of forcing a dependent adult into a fiduciary role he clearly can't handle." David grabbed the heavy iron key ring, a set I recognized instantly, keys that had been on Sarah's bedside table for years, keys I had assumed were for the shed. His hand trembled as he pocketed them. He walked toward the office door, paused and looked back at Mark, a sudden spark of defiance in his eyes that I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. "If I accept, Mark, you're not getting near this house for anything, not even to visit." He pushed the door open and walked out into the hallway, the sound of his footsteps echoing down toward the quiet, shadowed end of the house, where the South Wing lay. Mark and I exchanged a look of profound unease before following him, slower, deliberately keeping our distance, watching as David stopped before the heavy, unmarked door at the very end of the hall, the door Sarah had always kept locked, even from me. He inserted the largest key, turned it with a loud, grinding click, and pulled the door inward. A wave of warm, oddly scented air, like old paper and exotic spices, wafted out. David stepped across the threshold, pulling the door shut behind him with a soft thud. We heard the bolt slide home from the outside, then silence. Mark and I exchanged a look of growing panic. We waited 5 minutes, 10, 15. Mark finally pounded on the wood. "David, open up! What is happening in there?" Silence. We waited another agonizing 5 minutes, the weight of the mortgage and the bizarre secrecy pressing down on us. Just as Mark raised his hand to deliver a truly forceful knock, a sound drifted from behind the sealed door. Not David's voice, but a low, rhythmic humming. Clearly a woman's voice, singing in a language neither of us recognized, followed by a distinct brittle sound like glass, shattering on stone. The sound, the strange, melodious humming in an unknown tongue, followed by that sharp, decisive tink of breaking glass, sent a jolt of cold adrenaline through both Mark and me. Mark's earlier calculated calm evaporated instantly. He slammed his fist against the heavy oak door, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the otherwise silent house. "David, that's enough! Open this door right now!" Mark roared, his voice vibrating with genuine fear now, the inheritance dispute momentarily forgotten in the face of the unknown. I rushed forward, putting a hand on Mark's shoulder, trying to pull him back. "Wait, Mark! We don't know what's in there. If Sarah went to this much trouble to keep this person separate..." "Separate? Dad, that's my brother in there with a literal stranger who's singing pagan lullabies and smashing things." Mark wrenched himself free and grabbed the doorknob, twisting it violently. It didn't budge. The bolt David had thrown from the inside was heavy-duty, clearly installed by Sarah long before we ever suspected an issue. We listened intently, holding our breath. The humming stopped abruptly. The silence that returned was absolute, heavier than before, charged with expectation. We waited, muscles tensed, expecting David to shout an explanation, or perhaps an apology for the noise. Instead, a new sound emerged from behind the door, a slow, deliberate scraping. It sounded like heavy furniture being dragged across the hardwood floor, moving from the center of the room toward the door itself. It was slow, agonizingly labored, as if something massive was being positioned directly against the only exit. Mark looked at me, his face pale beneath his usual tan. He's barricading himself in. Dad, we have to get him out. We can't just break down the door, Mark, not without knowing the liability, I argued, though my own heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I pictured David, young and unprepared, facing down whatever entity Sarah had tasked him with protecting or containing. What liability is worse than David being held hostage by some bizarre recluse Sarah invited into our home? Mark demanded, already scanning the nearby hallway. He spotted the brass fire poker set leaning near the living room entrance. He snatched it up, the poker's weight looking small in his large hands, but his intent was clear. Mark, stop, let me try the keys again. Maybe there's a skeleton key for the bolt, I pleaded, reaching for the ring David still carried. No time, Mark grunted. He positioned the hooked end of the poker near the seam of the door, just above the lock mechanism. He took a deep breath, preparing to use brute force, when suddenly a thin stream of yellowish-white smoke began to snake out from under the door, pooling rapidly on the antique runner rug. It smelled sharp, acrid, like burning sulfur mixed with those heavy, sweet spices. We both recoiled, choking as the smoke thickened, beginning to aggressively seep out around the doorframe. This was no ordinary smoke. It was moving too fast, too thickly, clinging low to the floor. That's not an electrical fire, I coughed, wiping my eyes. David, get away from the door! The scraping stopped again, and then from directly behind the door, a new sound, a whisper, close to the wood, impossibly loud in the sudden, stifling atmosphere. It wasn't David. The voice was ancient, papery, and distinctly feminine, yet laced with a strange, deep resonance that felt like it was vibrating in my bones. He has the letter. He must not read the letter. Mark dropped the fire poker with a clang. He stared at the door, mouth agape. That voice. It was utterly alien to the familiar sounds of our home. Before either of us could process the sheer terror of hearing an unknown entity address us from inside our son's newly inherited apartment. The heavy wooden door bowed inward with a sickening crack, splintering near the hinges as if something immense on the inside had slammed against it. The yellow smoke momentarily cleared, revealing a distorted glimpse through the widening gap. Not David, not a piece of furniture, but a fleeting shadow. Tall, impossibly thin, and moving with a strange, jerky quickness. Then a sound from inside that transcended mere panic. David let out a short, choked cry, a sound of utter realization and defeat, followed immediately by the sound of paper, tearing violently, as if a critical document was being ripped to shreds just inches away from the door. And then the sound stopped. Utter silence again. The smoke began to dissipate, thinning into harmless wisps, but the door remained cracked open, revealing only darkness beyond. Mark grabbed the broken knob, wrenching the door fully open this time. We rushed into the South Wing apartment, expecting chaos, expecting David to be injured or restrained. The apartment was pristine, no broken furniture, no lingering smoke smell, save for a faint trace of ozone. The South Wing was empty. David was gone. The only thing left on the center rug, exactly where the smoke had pooled, was a small, charred, half-moon piece of what looked like high-quality parchment, utterly unreadable, and a single ornate silver key. The key to the chest Sarah kept hidden under the floorboards in my study. The sudden emptiness of the South Wing was more terrifying than any sound or shadow could have been. The apartment was immaculate, almost unnervingly so. The heavy scent of spices and old paper lingered, but the aggressive smoke was gone, leaving the air cool and still. David was nowhere. The only tangible evidence of the preceding chaos were the two objects lying on the antique Persian rug, the sliver of charred parchment and the strange silver key. Mark snatched the key first, his eyes wild. That's not one of the house keys. That's the old Florentine key. Mom kept that on the highest shelf in her cedar chest. The one she always claimed was just for sentimental jewelry. I stared at the fragment of paper. It was thick, almost vellum, and the burn mark was precise, eating away exactly half of whatever script had been on it. The remaining portion showed just a few looping, elegant letters in what looked like Sarah's own handwriting, perhaps part of a sentence or a signature. I knelt down, carefully using the corner of my handkerchief to lift the delicate shard. If that was the letter she left for David, the one Mr. Henderson mentioned, someone or something destroyed it right after he saw it, I whispered, my mind racing wildly to connect the dots. The mortgage, the secret tenant, the voice, and now David's disappearance. Sarah hadn't just left an inheritance. She'd left a puzzle laced with immediate danger. The voice said, "He has the letter. He must not read the letter." Mark repeated, his gaze fixed on the silver key in his hand. If David read it, he knew something that made him disappear or made it take him. And why would Mom leave the key to her secret chest right here? We searched the south wing frantically. Every door led to a closed closet or a pristine empty bedroom. There was no watcher visible, no sign of a struggle beyond the cracked hinges of the main door. It was as if David and the occupant of this wing had simply evaporated into the warm air. Suddenly, I realized something crucial about the silver key. It wasn't just a key to Sarah's chest, it was the key to my study's hidden compartment. The one I had built into the wall behind the false bookshelf, the one I thought only I knew about. Sarah had watched me build it 20 years ago, and I had always assumed she'd forgotten the precise mechanism. Mark, that key opens the compartment in my study, the one where I keep my grandfather's journals, I explained, my voice strained. She must have known I'd recognize it. She wanted us to look there. We bolted out of the south wing, Mark still clutching the key and the charred fragment, and hurried back toward the main living area of the house. The atmosphere had shifted. The house no longer felt like a monument to Sarah's memory, but a carefully constructed trap designed to force our hand. My study was untouched, smelling faintly of leather and aging paper. The bookshelf was undisturbed. Mark, moving with surprising dexterity for someone usually focused on spreadsheets, found the nearly invisible seam where the compartment opened. He inserted the silver key. It turned smoothly, and with a soft click, a section of the bottom shelf slid inward, revealing a dark recess. Inside wasn't a stack of journals. There was only one item, a slim, black, leather-bound book, clearly new, unlike the dusty journals I expected. Lying on top of it was a single crisp white envelope, sealed with a wax stamp bearing an unfamiliar, complex sigil, a coiled serpent wrapped around an hourglass. Mark reached for the envelope first, but I stopped him, my hand closing over his wrist. Wait, that sigil, I've seen that before, decades ago, in Europe when I was stationed overseas during that sensitive deployment. That was the mark of the Alchemists' Circle. They were rumored to deal in esoteric finance and, well, things far beyond conventional banking. Mark stared at the envelope, then back at the charred scrap in his other hand. Esoteric finance? Dad, is this about the mortgage? Did Mom get involved with some cult to pay down our house debt? The rumors were always that they dealt in guarantees, I said, pulling my hand back, feeling a terrifying coldness creep into my certainty about Sarah. Irrevocable guarantees often paid for with something far more valuable than money. Ignoring my apprehension, Mark slid his thumb under the wax seal of the envelope, breaking the ancient symbol with a harsh crackle. He pulled out a single sheet of heavy paper. He didn't read it aloud. He just scanned it, his eyes darting rapidly across the page. His face went through a rapid series of emotions. Confusion, dawning horror, a flicker of something that might have been awe, and then finally, absolute crushing finality. He lowered the letter slowly, his hand trembling so violently the paper rustled like dry leaves. He looked not at me, but through me, his focus miles away. "Mark, what does it say?" I urged, stepping closer to the hidden compartment, peering into the darkness where the journal lay. Mark finally managed to articulate a single word, his voice raw, stripped of all pretense. "Bargain." "What bargain?" He swallowed hard, his gaze locked on the dark leather-bound book in the recess. "It's not just the mortgage. It's the price for the house. Sarah didn't pay it off. She made an arrangement. The letter says the debt is tied to the watcher's identity, and the watcher is the collateral. If David accepted the house, he inherited the contract. If he tears up the agreement— Mark gestured weakly toward the book. This book isn't a journal, Dad. It's the ledger, and the final entry. The final entry states the terms of retrieval for the collateral in the event of a breach. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a profound, unspeakable terror that mirrored the horror I felt, recognizing the circle's seal. The ledger says that if the contract is broken, the debt defaults to the next living male heir, and the collateral, the watcher, is released upon the heir's immediate relocation to the property. Before I could process the monstrous implications that David might have just triggered a clause that meant we were now expected to take in this terrifying entity, a faint scratching sound began emanating from inside the black leather book itself, directly where Mark had just laid the letter down. It wasn't the sound of paper moving. It was a deliberate, insistent tapping, growing steadily louder, coming from within the sealed pages of the ledger. The tapping from inside the ledger escalated instantly from a faint scratch to a frantic, insistent rhythm, as if something small and desperate was trapped within the leather binding, trying to claw its way out. Mark recoiled instantly, dropping the letter and stumbling back against the heavy oak desk, knocking over a stack of framed family photos. I didn't hesitate. Recognition, sharp and agonizing, pierced through the terror. I knew that tapping. Sarah had taught it to me decades ago, a rudimentary Morse code signal she used when she was locked in her study during particularly bad migraines, a way to let me know she was conscious but couldn't speak. "It's David," I choked out, lunging forward toward the compartment. "He's inside the book. He found a way to hide, or he was forced into that space." I jammed my hand into the recess, ignoring the strange, faintly metallic heat radiating from the black leather. The tapping intensified, desperate and rapid. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, SOS. Mark, recovering from his shock, grabbed the charred fragment of paper from the floor. "Dad, wait, look at the scrap. If he read the agreement, he knows the penalty. If we take him out now, we breach the contract, and whatever watcher is, it comes for us." "I don't care about the contract, Mark." "That's my son!" I roared, gripping the ledger. I noticed the tapping was localized not just to the cover, but to the spine. I braced the book against the edge of the shelf and yanked the cover backward with all my strength, ripping the binding completely free from the pages. The noise inside ceased instantly. The cover swung open, revealing the inner pages intact. There was no sign of David, no creature, just densely packed, meticulous rows of numbers and names. The actual ledger of the alchemist's circle, detailing decades of financial trades, oaths, and collateral exchanges. My blood ran cold. If David wasn't inside the book, where was he? And who, or what, had been tapping? Just as I stared, paralyzed by the incomprehensible data in the ledger, a small, smooth object rolled out from between the pages and landed softly at my feet. It was a house key, the key to the front door. Simultaneously, the outer door to my study swung wide open, revealing David standing there, leaning heavily against the jamb. He looked utterly exhausted, his clothes dusty, but otherwise unharmed. He looked directly at the ledger in my hands, then at the silver key Mark still held. A slow, agonizing wave of understanding washed over his face, followed by profound relief. "Dad? Mark?" David breathed, looking confusedly at the broken book in my hands. "What happened? I only just got back to the main hall. I was going to tell you I refused the inheritance." "Refused? You were in there. We heard you. The voice, the smoke, the breaking." Mark stammered, pointing wildly back toward the south wing. David shook his head slowly. "I never made it past the foyer of the south wing. The minute I opened the door, this woman was standing there. She was old, maybe late 70s, dressed in a simple gray smock, but her eyes, they were black, like polished onyx. She wasn't hostile, Dad. She was just waiting." He walked slowly into the study, rubbing his temples. "She introduced herself as the Watcher. She said she knew I'd be coming and that Sarah had given me a choice. She showed me the letter, the one that was ripped up. It wasn't the terms of the debt. It was a warning. A warning about what? I demanded, still clutching the ledger, the tapping sound echoing ominously in my memory. About the ledger, David whispered, pointing at the book. She said the ledger doesn't just track debts, it is the debt. The alchemists don't trade in currency, Dad. They trade in living memories, in lifetimes. Sarah didn't use her life as collateral for the mortgage. She used the memory of the debt to keep this contract dormant. The tapping we heard wasn't me trapped. It was her, the watcher, sending a signal from the ledger itself. He looked at the silver key in Mark's hand. The watcher said that if I accepted the house, I inherited the contract, and she, the collateral, would become my responsibility, 24/7. If I refused the house, the contract would default immediately to the next male heir, Mark, meaning he'd be forced to take on the debt and take me, the original collateral holder, as his responsibility. Mark looked down at the ledger, then at the intact key in his hand, his face a mask of dawning horror. He finally understood what Sarah had truly protected him from. If he had taken the house, he wouldn't have inherited a mortgage. He would have inherited an ancient sentient obligation that needed constant dedicated care, an obligation that had just been signaling for rescue from within its prison of parchment. David continued, his voice gaining strength as he explained the final twist. The watcher then gave me the front door key and told me to leave, that Sarah had secured a temporary reprieve. She said the real problem wasn't the debt, but the fact that the true collateral, the memory of the contract, was bound in that black book. She said Sarah had put the signal in the book to draw our attention, knowing we'd break it open. When I realized the ledger contained the true price, I didn't tear up the contract to save myself. I tore up the record of the debt on the fragment you have, Mark, to buy time. He walked over and gently closed the study door, leaning his forehead against the wood. The watcher explained that to truly nullify the agreement without immediately triggering the penalty clauses, someone had to take the ledger, the repository of the debt, and voluntarily lock themselves away with it, taking on the watcher's role in reverse. She said the debt needs a conscious holder to remain dormant. David turned back to us, his eyes shining with resolve and a strange, inherited wisdom. She was never living in the South Wing to be looked after, Dad. She was there to watch the ledger. And since Mark and I both refused to take on the burden, and since I couldn't destroy the entire book without unleashing whatever financial monstrosity is recorded inside. He reached out, gently plucking the black ledger from my stunned fingers. He held it carefully, almost affectionately. I inherited the house. That means I inherit the obligations. But the debt needs a permanent warden, not a temporary caretaker. Sarah knew I would be the one to finally understand. He walked toward the recess in the bookshelf where the ledger belonged. He didn't put the book in the compartment. Instead, he slid the compartment door shut, sealing the ledger inside the wall, the silver key still in Mark's hand, serving as the only external lock. "I'm not taking the house, Mark," David said calmly, finally meeting his brother's gaze. "I'm taking the role. I'll be the watcher now. I'll stay here, quiet, watching the walls, ensuring the debt never calls out again. That's the only way to truly keep Sarah's legacy, and us, safe." He turned and walked out of the study, heading not toward the south wing, but toward the attic staircase, the place where Sarah kept her oldest, most forgotten things. As he reached the landing, he looked back one last time, a faint knowing smile on his lips. "Tell Mom I'm sorry I didn't answer her calls sooner." And then the attic door swung shut behind him, leaving Mark and me alone in the study, standing between a locked wall that held an ancient financial curse and the chilling realization that David, the directionless boy who couldn't find his path, had just found his purpose as the silent guardian of our family's impossible secret.